When people think of the Renaissance, they mostly think in terms of art. That's very understandable, but art is only one small part of what went into the Renaissance and, of course, what comes out of the Renaissance. As the Renaissance developed, it was shaped by 5 major developments, and I'll briefly talk about the important aspects of each and how they affected how Europeans viewed and thought about their world and changed the history of philosophy. Yes, of course, art. In 1425, Tommaso Masaccio discovered how to paint using the technique of perspective. This allowed artists to create much more realistic-looking paintings, and every artist from Masaccio's time on studied his work. A new era of innovation in various forms of art developed, leading to the High Renaissance, around 1500, and famous artists like Leonardo, Raphael, and the other Mutant Ninja Turtles. What the new art forms did was give people a new perspective on the world. The rise of naturalism in art, both in style and subject matter, in the early 1500s was a radical change. No longer was art exclusively portraying noblemen and religious scenes. Art now also showed the natural world and normal people going about their everyday business. People could now relate art to their everyday lives and see themselves in it. Philosophy at this time was greatly influenced by, in the 1440s and 1450s, the Ottoman Turks gaining the territories of the once great Byzantine Empire. Many Christian clergy and monastic communities fled west, and they brought with them their libraries. In those libraries were lost copies of the lost works of Plato and books by Greek mathematicians and proto-scientists. These works were translated from Greek into Latin and became popular, like the works of Aristotle and the Islamic scholars had done 300 years earlier. Ironically, because Aristotelianism and Thomism had become, by the 15th century, so dry and staid, the rediscovery of the rest of Plato excited many, and the discovery of Greek math and proto-scientific works sparked a rethinking of how the natural world was to be viewed. Here, the Greeks were doing what William of Ockham had been talking about, observing the world and using our God-given reason to understand God's creation. Philosophy in the late 1400s and early 1500s led directly to the birth of modern science. But before that happened, there was the era of discovery and trade. In 1432, Europeans lost access to some of the spice routes to the Far East when the Ottoman Turks defeated Venice in a war. The situation was made worse when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Prices skyrocketed, and since food without spice is really dull, something had to happen. In the 1460s, 70s, and 80s, Portuguese traders began exploring down the western African coast looking for a route to the Far East that did not go through Ottoman territory. One Portuguese trader, often incorrectly thought to be Spanish because he found patronage under the Spanish crown, was Christopher Columbus, and he thought he knew a shortcut. He knew the newly discovered Greek text revealed that the earth was round, and some commentators interpreted the Greek texts to indicate that the earth was only about 20,000 kilometers, which is half the actual value, and so Columbus was expecting that if he went west about 7,000 kilometers, he'd reach India and the Spice Islands. Well, he reached the Caribbean islands instead, but called the inhabitants there Indians because the science of his day told him that's where he was. The discovery of the New World, it didn't take them long to figure out it wasn't Asia, was a development that we really cannot understand or appreciate today. For 2 millennia, European culture had seen itself as a fortress Europe, impassable desert to the south, vicious barbarians to the east, frozen barbarians to the north, and impassable ocean to the west. The New World doubled the size of the known world, offered incredible natural resources, and as the Spanish discovered to their glee, the natives were lightly armed. Within 40 years, Spain had conquered vast territories from what is now Mississippi and California to what is now Bolivia, creating a series of colonial dictatorships. Portugal colonized the coast of Brazil, but directed most of its efforts to Africa and Asia. This is because in 1494, in perhaps the most arrogant political agreement in history, the crown heads of Portugal and Spain divided the New World between them, giving Spain all lands west of and Portugal all lands east of an imaginary north-south line that cut through the Atlantic Ocean and part of Brazil and meeting on the other side of the globe. By 1500, Portugal had established a trading post in India. The race to conquer the world was on, and the European colonial powers fought to carve up the world between them. This war for land and resources dominated politics and economics for the next 3 centuries, and in some respects still today. Colonialization instilled in many Europeans' minds the idea of endless progress and that the world was there to be won by the strongest and smartest. Also, the discovery of new species of plants and animals greatly expanded scientific curiosity about the world. But in the meantime, what allowed Spain and Portugal to get a head start on colonization was because the rest of Europe was embroiled in a growing political controversy. The role of the Catholic Church in personal and state affairs had been debated widely for centuries. The Church had, by around 1200, become a major player in politics and wars, and with power had become very wealthy and very corrupt. William of Ockham was one philosopher who argued that the Church's power and wealth should be curtailed. Around 1400, Jan Hus made a very similar argument and added the idea that individual communities should have the right to some religious self-determination and that the religious sacraments be opened to the laity. For this, he was executed in 1415, his teachings perceived as a threat to the balance of power. Though Hus's arguments were based on the Bible, his movement was primarily political: religious freedom, equality between clergy and laity, self-determination, democratic election of leaders, and the end of clerical power in secular affairs. In the 1400s, there were several times more political states in Europe than today, and their governments and peoples were divided over these new ideas of increased political and religious freedoms. The growing debate came to a head when Martin Luther, in 1517, publicly criticized the Church with arguments similar to Hus a century earlier. But now the political atmosphere was different, and Luther was able to find a protector. What Luther did was light a match in a gasoline-soaked Central Europe, and by 1524 the first rebellions and defections from the old political religious order began. Most states and individuals chose sides between the old order and the new protesters, or Protestants, and Europe was plunged into over a century of turmoil and war, the climax of which was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. It was truly the First World War, in which at some point every European power was involved. Regardless of the death and carnage, the movements for political freedom and self-determination resonated powerfully in philosophy, as we shall see. Ah yes, science. The developments previously mentioned in the first 4 influences had a hand in the founding of modern science. Some ancient Greeks had a view of the world that foreshadowed science. But with the political, philosophical, and economic changes in the 1500s, the environment was ripe for a scientific revolution. One spark of the revolution was when, in 1572, a new star, a nova, appeared in the night sky as bright as Venus. This was shocking because everyone had always assumed the heavens were unchanging. It was a staple of thought going back to the ancient Greeks. The undeniable new star challenged the concept of celestial unchangeability, a concept then completely undermined by the Great Comet of 1577. one of the brightest comets ever recorded. The comet's tail spread across a third of the night sky, and some claimed you could actually read by its light. Astronomer Tycho Brahe proved the comet was farther away from the Earth than the Moon, meaning that the millennia-old idea that the realm above the Moon was perfect and unchanging, sorry Plato, was false. These events happened in the middle of the debate over the heliocentric theory developed by Polish astronomer Mikołaj Kopernik, or Copernicus in Latin, and helped sway learned opinion to the heliocentric theory. Astronomy led the scientific revolution. Another nova in 1604 sealed the deal on a changeable heavens, and in 1609 Johannes Kepler published a theory of planetary motion showing the planetary orbits were not perfect circles, sorry Plato, but elliptical. The notion of planetary motion as perfect circles had dominated since Plato's time, mostly through Ptolemy, but Kepler's mathematical proof that the orbits were slightly imperfect matched observations and explained retrograde planetary motion, a phenomenon that had long vexed astronomers. Kepler's theory destroyed the known universe and proved the idea that mathematics and reason could indeed describe natural phenomena, putting an end to centuries of philosophical debate. In the 1620s, in a triumph of these developments, Francis Bacon wrote several books that attempted to establish a methodology for the new sciences, in particular, rules for inductive reasoning. And all of these events, all of these things that were happening in the Renaissance, provide the foundation for the rest of Western civilization, both in positive and negative ways. And these events that were happening in the Renaissance are definitely affecting the whole rest of the history of Western philosophy.